It didn't end the way you thought it would. No warning, no closure that felt complete. Just distance, silence, and a space in your life where someone used to be. You replayed it 100 times, wondered what you did, wondered why it had to happen like that. Because when someone leaves suddenly or is removed without explanation, it doesn't just hurt your heart. It shakes your understanding of God. But what if that ending wasn't loss? What if it was protection? Stay with me. Watch this video till end. Subscribe and like for more. And before this is over, you may see that goodbye very differently. You didn't just lose a person. You lost a presence you had built your world around. Their voice became your comfort. Their approval became your reassurance. Their consistency became the thing that steadied you when everything else felt uncertain. And without even realizing it, your heart wrapped itself around them so tightly that you couldn't tell where your trust in God ended and your dependence on them began. It wasn't wrong to love them. It wasn't weakness to care deeply. But somewhere along the way, the attachment grew stronger than the assignment on your life. You started making decisions based on keeping them. You filtered your obedience through their reaction. You delayed certain steps because you were afraid they wouldn't understand. And slowly, quietly, your direction began bending around your attachment. That's the part that hurts to admit, because when they were removed, it felt violent. It felt like something sacred was ripped away without warning. You questioned God. You questioned yourself. You wondered why something that felt so meaningful had to end so abruptly. But what if it ended because it had become too central? When a person becomes your source instead of God being your source, removal becomes necessary, not to punish you, not to break you, but to realign you, to remind you that no human being can carry the weight of your purpose. No relationship can replace your calling. What felt like heartbreak was actually exposure. Exposure how much you had leaned, how much you had tied your stability to someone who was never meant to hold that role. And sometimes what's being broken isn't the relationship, it's a dependency, because your assignment requires freedom. And freedom cannot exist where attachment controls your obedience. You felt it before it happened, that subtle tension when you started changing, when your habits shifted, when your standards rose, when your conversations became deeper and your tolerance for certain things became lower. You were growing, not loudly, not arrogantly, but steadily, and it made them uncomfortable. At first, you tried to ignore it. You softened your words. You laughed at things you had outgrown. You downplayed your discipline so it wouldn't feel like distance. You told yourself you were just being humble, just keeping the peace. But if you're honest, you were shrinking. You were editing parts of yourself to make the relationship easier, holding back your convictions so they wouldn't feel judged, staying quiet about your growth so they wouldn't feel left behind. You began managing their comfort at the expense of your calling. Growth creates tension, not because growth is wrong, but because it exposes gaps. And not everyone wants to confront the distance between where they are and where you're headed. There was a version of you emerging, more focused, more aware, more aligned. And instead of fully stepping into it, you started negotiating with it. You told yourself it wasn't that serious, that you could slow down, that you didn't need to change that much. But deep down, you knew you were compromising. You knew you were lowering your standards just enough to avoid conflict. You knew you were choosing comfort over expansion. And sometimes, God removes someone not because they are evil, not because they are toxic, but because you were about to trade your evolution for their approval. That removal felt painful. It felt sudden. It felt unfair. But it stopped you from shrinking. It forced you to grow without apology, to rise without editing yourself, to become without asking permission. And now, when you look back, you can see it clearly. You weren't losing them. You were losing the version of you that was willing to stay small. Some people knew you when you were still unsure of yourself. They met you in the middle of your confusion, when your standards were lower, when your boundaries were blurry, when you were still figuring out who you were and what you stood for. They grew comfortable with that version of you, familiar with your old patterns, your old fears, your old limitations. But you are not that person anymore. And that's where the tension begins. Because growth changes access. When your identity shifts, your circle cannot remain the same. Not everyone who walked with you through your process is meant to stand beside you in your promise. Some people were assigned to a chapter, not the whole story. If they stayed, they would keep measuring you against your past. They would remind you of who you used to be every time you tried to step into who you're becoming. Even unintentionally, they would anchor you to old habits, old mindsets, old versions of yourself that no longer fit. And that constant comparison would slowly pull you backward. There are seasons that require privacy. Seasons where you are rebuilding your identity quietly. Where you are breaking patterns without announcing it. Where you are becoming someone new before the world has language for it. That transformation is fragile in the beginning, not weak, just forming. And too much familiarity can disrupt it. When someone is removed, it doesn't always mean they were bad. Sometimes it means your next level requires less access, less commentary, less history, because history can be heavy. You don't need constant reminders of who you were when you are fighting to become who you're called to be. You don't need old narratives echoing while you're rewriting your identity. Removal protects your transformation. It gives you room to evolve without comparison, space to grow without explanation, freedom to step into your next version without being pulled back into your last one. Not everyone is meant to see who you're becoming. And that's not loss. That protection of your future. When it first happened, you didn't understand it. That was the hardest part. If it had at least made sense, you could have processed it. If there had been a clear reason, a visible betrayal, an obvious ending, you could have accepted it faster. But instead, there was confusion, silence, a gap between what you felt and what you could explain. You kept searching for answers, replaying conversations, looking for hidden signs, trying to piece together a reason that would make the pain feel justified. And because you couldn't understand it, you tried to fix it. You thought maybe if you said the right thing, prayed harder, reached out one more time, it would shift back into place. You weren't just grieving the loss. You were fighting the mystery of it. But what if the lack of clarity was intentional? Sometimes distance comes before explanation. Not to frustrate you, but to protect the decision. Because if you understood too soon, you might have interfered. You might have tried to rebuild something that was meant to end. You might have convinced yourself that temporary comfort was worth permanent misalignment. Confusion kept you from interfering. There are endings that cannot survive negotiation. There are separations that must remain firm. And sometimes clarity only arrives after your heart has detached enough to handle the truth. Closure doesn't always come through conversation. It doesn't always arrive wrapped in apology or agreement. Sometimes it comes through elevation, through growth, through waking up one day and realizing you no longer feel the same pull you once did. You didn't understand it then because you weren't meant to. Understanding too early would have pulled you back. It would have softened a boundary that needed to stay strong. Now, as time passes and you look at your life, the distance makes more sense than the details ever could. The delay in understanding wasn't neglect. It was protection in disguise. After they left, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt chaotic. You expected relief. You expected clarity. Instead, your emotions were everywhere. One day you felt strong. The next day you questioned everything. Doubt got louder. Old fears resurfaced. Your thoughts felt heavier than they had in months. And you started wondering if losing them had destabilized something inside you. But what if the chaos wasn't collapse? What if it was expansion? Whenever your future expands, resistance increases. Not because you made the wrong move, but because you stepped into new territory. And new territory requires space. When someone exits your life, it creates that space. But space feels unfamiliar at first. It feels empty. It echoes, and in that echo, your insecurities get louder. The emotional war that followed their removal wasn't random. It wasn't proof that you needed them. It was proof that something bigger was unfolding. You were detaching from what was behind you while simultaneously stretching toward what's ahead. That stretch feels like tension. Have you noticed how your life started accelerating after they exited? That's not coincidence. Opportunities began shifting. Your awareness sharpened. Your priorities became clearer. Even your prayers started sounding different. But acceleration attracts friction. The moment you move forward, internal and external resistance try to test whether you're serious. The warfare wasn't about them. It was about you, about whether you would retreat back to familiarity or step fully into the future that requires freedom. Because what's ahead of you cannot coexist with certain attachments from your past. And when those attachments are removed, everything in you has to recalibrate. That recalibration feels like instability before it feels like strength. The tension you felt was confirmation. Confirmation that your future expanded the moment that door closed. Confirmation that your life required more room than that relationship allowed. The chaos wasn't destruction. It was construction happening underneath the surface. You prayed for more purpose, more clarity, more growth. You asked to be stretched, to be used, to step into something bigger than where you were. And when you said those prayers, you imagined opportunity. You imagined doors opening. You imagined elevation feeling exciting. You didn't imagine loss. You didn't imagine that growth would require letting go of people you genuinely cared about. You didn't expect that the answer to your prayer would come wrapped in separation. But growth always carries a cost. And sometimes that cost is comfort. Sometimes it's familiarity. Sometimes it's relationships that once felt permanent. That's the part no one talks about. When you ask for expansion, your capacity has to increase. And not everyone fits inside your new capacity. Some people were aligned with your old level of thinking, your old habits, your old limitations. They were comfortable in the version of you that was still figuring things out. But the version of you that is rising, that one requires different conversations, different standards, different alignment. And trying to carry everyone into your next season would have slowed you down. You felt that tension. The pull between staying loyal to what felt safe and stepping fully into what you asked for. You tried to make both coexist. You tried to grow without outgrowing. You tried to elevate without creating distance. But calling and comfort rarely move in the same direction. Holding on to them might have preserved the relationship, but it would have delayed your development. It would have kept you negotiating with a past you already outgrew. You asked for growth. And growth answered, not by adding more people, but by removing what no longer matched the life you've been praying for. Now you see it clearly. The cost was painful, but staying would have cost you more. When they left, it felt like rejection. It felt like you weren't enough, like you misread everything, like somehow you failed to be what they needed. And even if you tried to stay strong on the outside, there was a quiet voice inside you asking what you did wrong. Rejection feels personal. It feels like a verdict on your worth, like a door closing because you didn't measure up. And that's why it hurt so deeply. It wasn't just about losing them. It was about what their leaving seemed to say about you. But what if it wasn't a verdict? What if it was direction? Redirection doesn't always feel strategic in the moment. It feels sudden, disruptive, confusing, but its purpose is different. Rejection says you are not chosen. Redirection says this is not the path. And those are two completely different messages. There are conversations you were never meant to hear, situations you were never meant to endure, versions of yourself you were never meant to become just to keep something alive. You couldn't see it then, but that ending cut off outcomes that would have slowly drained you. Sometimes protection doesn't look gentle. It looks like removal. And when you look back later, not emotionally, but clearly, you'll start to see the patterns, the compromises you almost made, the standards you almost lowered, the stress you almost normalized. You will see how staying would have shaped you into someone smaller, more anxious, more disconnected from who you're meant to be. You weren't rejected. You were redirected, not away from love, not away from connection, but away from a path that would have cost you your peace and your growth. And one day, you'll thank God not for what stayed, but for what left, because the removal didn't reduce your value. It preserved your future.